Sophie Gardner's shoulders ached as she trudged toward the bus stop. 3 morning classes, followed by an 8-hour shift at Brood Awakening, the local coffee shop that helped pay her half of the rent, had left her drained. The November wind bit through her thin blue hoodie, a reminder that winter was approaching and she still couldn't afford a proper coat. The number 42 bus pulled up right on time. Sophie climbed aboard, flashed her monthly pass to the driver, a grumpy middle-aged man with perpetually furrowed brows, and slumped into a seat near the back. She pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the city lights blur together as exhaustion settled deeper into her bones. "Wait," a male voice called out just as the doors began to close. The driver reluctantly reopened them, and a young man in his early 20s jumped aboard, slightly out of breath. He wore jeans and a simple gray sweater that somehow looked expensive despite its plainness. His dark hair was windswept, and there was something about his confident posture that made several passengers glance up. "That'll be 3.50, the driver announced flatly. The young man patted his pockets with growing panic. "I'm sorry, I think I left my wallet in my other." He stopped mid-sentence, embarrassment crossing his features. "No money, no ride," the driver stated, pointing toward the door. "I've got a schedule to keep." Sophie watched the exchange, recognizing that look of humiliation. Without thinking, she stood up and walked forward, digging into her pocket for the loose change she'd received as a tip earlier. "Here," she said, extending her hand with $3.02. "I've got it." The young man turned, surprise evident in his hazel eyes. For a moment, he seemed about to refuse, but then nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I'll pay you back somehow." "Don't worry about it," Sophie replied with a tired smile before returning to her seat. The young man found a spot a few rows ahead, occasionally glancing back at her. Sophie barely noticed, already lost in thoughts about tomorrow's exam and whether her mom had remembered to take her medication. What Sophie couldn't know was that she had just helped Ethan Carter, whose family owned the Carter Grand hotels spanning 3 continents, the same Ethan whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines beside headlines about the hotel empire he would someday inherit. He looked back one more time at the girl in the blue hoodie, her eyes now closed, her face peaceful despite the obvious exhaustion, and felt something unfamiliar, a connection that had nothing to do with his last name or his family's wealth. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, 2 worlds briefly intersected, neither aware that this small moment would change everything. Sophie's fingers flew across the espresso machine with practiced efficiency. Steaming milk, grinding beans, and pouring perfect Rosetta patterns had become second nature after 2 years at Brood Awakening. The morning rush was in full swing, a line of caffeine-desperate customers stretching to the door. "Grande caramel latte with almond milk," she called out, sliding the cup across the counter. "Thanks," a familiar voice replied. Sophie glanced up and froze. Standing before her was the young man from the bus, the one she'd helped yesterday. In daylight, she noticed details she'd missed in the dim bus lighting, a defined jawline, intelligent eyes, and that same expensive-looking simplicity to his clothes. "It's you," she said, surprise evident in her voice. He smiled. "I told you I'd pay you back. For $3.50, you didn't have to come all this way." "Maybe I wanted good coffee too," he replied, a playful glint in his eyes. "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Sophie," she answered automatically, before her coworker Lisa nudged her urgently. "We've got 6 people waiting on drinks," Lisa hissed. "Right, sorry." Sophie turned back to Ethan. "I need to." "Of course," he said, dropping a $5 bill in the tip jar. "Thanks again, Sophie." She watched him choose a table by the window, pulling out a book rather than a phone, something that struck her as oddly refreshing. Throughout her shift, she caught him glancing up occasionally, their eyes meeting briefly before both looked away. When the rush finally died down, Sophie grabbed a rag and began wiping nearby tables. "So," she said, approaching Ethan's table, "do you make a habit of forgetting your wallet?" He laughed, closing his book. "Not usually. Yesterday was unusual." "How so?" "Let's just say I'm trying something different with my life." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Mysterious." His expression turned earnest. "I actually came back because..." He hesitated. "This might sound strange, but you're the first person who's done something nice for me without expectations." "It was just bus fare," Sophie said, confused by his intensity. "Still, I'd like to thank you properly. Maybe coffee sometime, when you're not working?" Sophie studied him, trying to read his intentions. There was something he wasn't saying, but his eyes seemed genuine. "I don't even know you. That's the point of coffee, isn't it? To get to know someone?" Before she could answer, her manager called from behind the counter, "Sophie, break's over." "I'm here most mornings," Ethan said quickly. "Think about it." Sophie nodded hesitantly before returning to work. Throughout the day, she found herself glancing at the spot where he'd sat, now occupied by a student with headphones. She told herself it was ridiculous to feel disappointed when he didn't show up the next day. But when he appeared the following morning, casually ordering a black coffee and asking how her day was going, something warm flickered to life inside her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. What began as coincidence was quickly becoming routine. Though Sophie had no idea just how complicated that routine would become. So, let me get this straight, Sophie said, stirring her latte. You just decided to quit your corporate job and start over? It was their 5th coffee meetup in 2 weeks, this time after her shift ended. Ethan sat across from her at a small table in the back corner of Brood Awakening, his expression thoughtful. Something like that, he replied. The family business, it wasn't who I wanted to be. Sophie nodded, understanding more than he realized. My dad was like that. Had this whole life planned out for me, college, law school, joining his firm. When I chose art history instead, he stopped paying for anything. She shrugged, trying to make it seem less painful than it was. Haven't spoken to him in 3 years. Ethan leaned forward. That's rough. Is that why you work so many hours here? That, and helping Mom with rent. She's got health issues. Sophie surprised herself with her candor. Something about Ethan made it easy to open up. Anyway, enough about my sad backstory. What are you doing now, job-wise? Ethan shifted in his seat. Freelance consulting. Nothing exciting. Mr. Mysterious strikes again, Sophie teased. You never talk about your past because it's boring, compared to hearing about your passion for Renaissance art? Sophie rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. Smooth deflection. The coffee shop was nearly empty now. Outside, streetlights flickered on as dusk settled over the city. Sophie should have been heading home, she had reading to finish for tomorrow's class. But she found herself reluctant to end their conversation. Can I ask you something? Ethan said, his tone suddenly serious. Depends on the question. What do you want? Like, really want out of life? Sophie blinked, surprised by the directness. I want to finish my degree, get a job at a museum someday, maybe curate my own exhibition. She paused. And, not worry about money constantly. That would be nice. That's it? No dreams of world travel or mansions. Those things cost money I don't have, she laughed. I'm practical. But if money wasn't an issue, then I'd take my mom to Italy. She always wanted to see Florence. Sophie tilted her head. Your turn. What do you want, Ethan, whatever your last name is? He smiled, but his eyes held something she couldn't quite read. Freedom. To just be me. Not what others expect. And who is the real you? Sophie asked softly. I'm still figuring that out. His gaze met hers. But I feel more like myself when I'm with you than I have in a long time. The confession hung between them, honest and unguarded. Sophie felt a flutter in her chest that both excited and terrified her. I should go, she said finally, gathering her things. Early class tomorrow. Ethan nodded, walking her to the door. Same time next week? Maybe sooner, Sophie replied before she could second-guess herself. There's a student exhibition at my college Friday night. Nothing fancy, but I'd love for you to go. Ethan said immediately, as they parted ways outside. Sophie realized that for the first time in years, she was letting someone new into her carefully constructed world. She wasn't sure if it was wise, but something about Ethan made her want to take the risk. What she didn't see was Ethan's face after she left, the conflict and guilt shadowing his features as he pulled out a phone much more expensive than his simple clothes would suggest. The university gallery buzzed with conversation as students and faculty milled around, examining artwork displayed on pristine white walls. Sophie stood beside a series of photographs, not her work, but those of a friend who'd asked her to explain them to visitors. He's exploring urban decay as a metaphor for forgotten communities, she explained to an elderly professor, who nodded with polite interest. Her eyes kept drifting to the entrance. Ethan was 20 minutes late, and Sophie was beginning to think he wouldn't show. She checked her phone, no messages. Sorry I'm late, a voice said behind her. Sophie turned to find Ethan, slightly out of breath, his hair windblown. Couldn't find parking. You drove? Sophie asked, surprised. I thought you took the bus. Borrowed a friend's car, Ethan explained quickly. This exhibition meant a lot to you, so... Sophie smiled, letting her suspicion fade. I'm glad you made it. Let me show you around. As they walked through the gallery, Sophie noticed a few things that didn't quite add up. Ethan's simple watch, which he kept trying to hide under his sleeve, looked suspiciously like the luxury brand she'd seen in magazine ads. His knowledge of art was surprisingly sophisticated for someone who claimed to have a standard business background. And when he received a call, he stepped away to speak in hushed tones, returning with a tightness around his eyes. Everything okay? Sophie asked. Just work, he muttered. Sorry about that. Later, as they stood before a striking abstract painting, Sophie gathered her courage. Ethan, can I ask you something? Of course. Who are you, really? Sometimes I feel like you're hiding something. Ethan stiffened. What do you mean? Sophie gestured vaguely. That watch you're wearing costs more than my semester's tuition. You know way too much about 16th century Italian masters for someone who took one art history class in college. And whenever I ask about your family or where you live, you change the subject. I told you I worked in corporate. Which corporation? Sophie pressed. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. Sophie, try me. He hesitated, then slipped the watch off his wrist. It was my grandfather's. A family heirloom. Sophie wanted to believe him. The past few weeks with Ethan had been the brightest spot in her otherwise exhausting life. When they were together, talking about books or debating the merits of different artistic movements, she felt understood in a way she never had before. I like you, Sophie, Ethan said quietly. Isn't that what matters? A part of her wanted to push further, to demand the full truth, but the vulnerability in his eyes made her pause. Just don't lie to me, okay? I've had enough people walk out of my life. I don't need more disappointment. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I'm not going anywhere. As they continued through the gallery, Sophie told herself to be content with what Ethan was willing to share. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was only seeing a carefully constructed version of him, a canvas with significant portions left deliberately blank. What she didn't realize was how quickly those blank spaces would be filled in, whether Ethan wanted them to be or not. Sophie's shift ended at 10 p.m., later than usual due to a coworker calling in sick. The coffee shop was quiet as she wiped down the last tables, moonlight streaming through the windows. To her surprise, Ethan had stayed the entire evening, nursing a series of coffees and working on his laptop. You didn't have to wait, she said, untying her apron. I wanted to. Ethan closed his computer. Besides, it's late. I thought I'd walk you to the bus stop. Outside, the night air carried a crisp autumn chill. Sophie pulled her hoodie tighter around herself as they walked side by side, their shoulders occasionally brushing. You know what I realized today? Ethan asked, breaking the comfortable silence. What's that? It's been exactly 1 month since you saved me on the bus. Sophie laughed. Saved you? It was $3.50. It was more than that, Ethan said seriously. That day, I was trying something new, stepping away from. He paused. From expectations. You were the first person who didn't look at me and see. See what? Sophie prompted when he didn't continue. Ethan shook his head. It doesn't matter. What matters is that meeting you changed things for me. They stopped at the bus shelter, empty except for them. Sophie turned to face him, studying his features in the glow of the streetlight. You know what I think, she said. I think we met each other exactly when we needed to. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Getting philosophical on me, art girl? Sophie smiled. My mom always says there are no accidents in the universe. And what does your mom think about me? Ethan asked, stepping closer. She thinks it's suspicious that you've never come over for dinner. Is that an invitation? Sophie hesitated. Her apartment was small, nothing like what she imagined Ethan was used to, whatever his background really was. Maybe, if you promise not to judge our mismatched plates and the fact that the elevator breaks down twice a week. I would never, Ethan said softly. The air between them changed suddenly, charged with something neither had acknowledged until now. Sophie became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of Ethan's eyes dropping briefly to her lips. Sophie, he whispered. I've wanted to. She didn't let him finish. Rising slightly on her toes, Sophie pressed her lips to his, a gentle question that Ethan answered by pulling her closer, one hand cradling her face with unexpected tenderness. When they broke apart, Sophie felt lightheaded, her heart racing beneath her ribs. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, Ethan admitted, his forehead resting against hers. Sophie smiled. What took you so long? In the distance, the headlights of the approaching bus cut through the darkness. Sophie stepped back reluctantly. I'll see you tomorrow, she asked. Ethan nodded. Definitely. As the bus carried her home, Sophie touched her lips, replaying the moment in her mind. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for something more than just surviving each day. Whatever secrets Ethan was keeping, whatever complications lay ahead, tonight had felt real, a beginning rather than another dead end. What she couldn't see was Ethan still standing at the bus stop, his expression torn between joy and mounting guilt. Ethan paced his hotel suite, phone pressed to his ear. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city lights, twinkling like fallen stars against the sky. 3 weeks had passed since his first kiss with Sophie, and each day the weight of his deception grew heavier. "I need more time, Dad," he said, tension evident in his voice. "The Singapore project can wait." "Nothing can wait in this business," Richard Carter's clipped tone betrayed his impatience. "You've been finding yourself for nearly 2 months now. The board is asking questions." "I'm not finding myself," Ethan retorted. "I'm learning how real people live." His father's laugh was cold. "Playing poor isn't going to make you a better CEO, son. It's going to make you soft." Ethan glanced at his watch, the same one Sophie had noticed. In 30 minutes, he was supposed to meet her for dinner at her apartment. He'd finally agreed to meet her mother. "I have to go," he said abruptly. "This is about that girl, isn't it?" Richard's voice sharpened. "The coffee shop worker my investigator mentioned." Ethan's grip tightened on his phone. "You had me followed? I protect my investments. You're the future of Carter Hotels, whether you like it or not." After ending the call, Ethan stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Who was he trying to fool? Every morning, he left this luxury suite, changed into regular clothes in a public restroom, and pretended to be someone he wasn't, all to spend time with a woman who valued honesty above everything else. Sophie's voice echoed in his mind, "Just don't lie to me." But he had, every day, every conversation. The smell of homemade lasagna filled Sophie's small apartment. Her mother, Maria, moved slowly around the kitchen, her cane tapping against the linoleum floor. "He's late," Maria observed, checking the ancient clock on the wall. Sophie adjusted the mismatched plates on their tiny dining table. "Only by 10 minutes, Mom. He'll be here." As if summoned by her confidence, a knock sounded at the door. Sophie smoothed her dress, a thrift store find she'd spent hours altering, and took a deep breath before opening it. Ethan stood in the hallway, clutching a bouquet of lilies and a bottle of wine that Sophie suspected cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "Sorry I'm late," he said, his eyes conveying more apology than his words. "Work call ran long." Sophie accepted the flowers with a smile. "Come in. Mom's been dying to meet you." Dinner progressed pleasantly, with Maria sharing embarrassing stories from Sophie's childhood and Ethan charming them both with his genuine interest and respectful questions about Maria's life before her illness. "So, Ethan," Maria said as they finished dessert, "Sophie tells me you're in consulting. What kind, exactly?" Ethan hesitated, the familiar panic rising whenever his fabricated background was questioned. "Hotel management, primarily." "That sounds interesting," Maria nodded. "My late husband always said you can tell everything about a person by how they treat service workers." "I couldn't agree more," Ethan replied, meeting Sophie's eyes across the table. Later, as Sophie walked him to the door, she whispered, "She loves you." "I can tell." Ethan pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" she asked, pulling back to study his troubled expression. The words died in his throat. How could he explain that he wasn't just some ordinary guy, that his family controlled a billion-dollar empire, that soon he'd be expected to return to a world where people like Sophie were invisible? "Nothing," he said finally. "Just thank you for tonight." As he kissed her goodbye, Ethan knew he was running out of time. The truth was coming, one way or another. The Wednesday afternoon rush at Brood Awakening had finally slowed. Sophie wiped down the espresso machine, humming quietly to herself. The past few weeks with Ethan had been like something from a movie, late night conversations, weekend walks through the park, stolen kisses between her shifts. For once, her life felt balanced, despite her hectic schedule. "Can I get a cappuccino?" a voice asked. Sophie looked up to see a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a press badge hanging around her neck. "Coming right up," Sophie replied, starting the drink. The bell above the door chimed, and Ethan walked in, his face lighting up when he spotted Sophie. He barely had time to register the familiar face of a businessman from his father's company standing in line. "Ethan," the man squinted, then pulled out his phone. "No way." Ethan stiffened, his body going cold. A few customers turned their heads. "You look different," the man said, looking at Ethan's worn jeans and coffee-stained sweater. Before Ethan could react, a woman's voice cut through the room. "Ethan Carter?" The journalist stood near the counter, already pulling out her phone. "What are you doing here?" Sophie froze, the name registering immediately. Carter, as in Carter Grand Hotels, as in the luxury chain whose billboards loomed over the city. Ethan's expression collapsed. "Melissa, don't," Ethan started moving toward her. The journalist snapped several photos before Ethan could stop her. "Does your father know you're slumming it in coffee shops? Is this some kind of publicity stunt?" Sophie felt the room tilting. The cappuccino overflowed, hot milk spilling across the counter. "Sophie, I can explain." Ethan started moving toward her. "Ethan Carter," Sophie repeated, her voice hollow. As in the hotel air? The journalist looked between them, her eyes widening with understanding. Oh, this is rich. Literally. She turned to Sophie. Honey, do you work here? How long have you known him? She's not part of this, Ethan snapped. Leave her alone. But the damage was done. The journalist was already typing on her phone, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Hotel Air Ethan Carter spotted at local coffee shop. New life, or just a game, she muttered as she wrote. This will go viral within the hour. Sophie moved mechanically, cleaning up the spilled milk, her mind racing through every conversation, every moment with Ethan, reframing them all in this new, devastating context. Sophie, please, Ethan pleaded, reaching across the counter. So, it's true? Lisa, standing nearby, had her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. You're that Ethan Carter? Sophie turned sharply. You knew? No, Lisa said, shaking her head. But now it makes sense. You always tipped way too much, and that watch, I thought it was fake. She scoffed, looking disgusted. Ethan swallowed hard, guilt settling in his stomach. Sophie stepped back, her voice hollow. Were you ever going to tell me? Yes. I was trying to find the right time. The right time was before I fell for you, Sophie replied, her voice breaking. Not after everyone else already figured it out. Lisa appeared from the back room, sensing the tension. Everything okay, Sophie? Fine, Sophie managed. I'm taking my break now. Without another word to Ethan, she untied her apron and walked to the staff room, closing the door behind her. Only then did she allow the tears to fall. Leave me alone, Ethan, Sophie said, quickening her pace as she left the coffee shop through the back exit. Her shift had ended, but the humiliation still burned fresh. Ethan followed her into the alley, desperate. Sophie, please, just give me 5 minutes. She whirled around, eyes flashing. 5 minutes? You had 2 months to tell me the truth. 2 months of watching me count tips and worry about my mom's medical bills while you... Her voice caught. While you what? Played poor for fun? It wasn't like that, Ethan insisted. When we met on that bus, I was trying to experience life without the Carter name hanging over me. For once, I wanted someone to see just me. But it wasn't just you, was it? Sophie's voice dropped dangerously low. It was a character you created. The struggling consultant, the humble guy rebuilding his life. She laughed bitterly. God, I feel so stupid. Everything I told you about myself, my thoughts, my feelings, what I want from life, that was all real. Except the part where you're heir to $1 billion empire. Sophie shook her head. That's not some minor detail, Ethan. That's your entire life. People passed by on the main street, some glanced curiously at their heated exchange. Sophie became aware that she was creating a scene and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. Do you know what the worst part is? She asked quietly. I trusted you. I let you meet my mom. I told you things I've never told anyone. Tears threatened again, but she blinked them back. And all that time, you were lying to my face. Ethan reached for her hand, but Sophie stepped away. Sophie, I was going to tell you, I swear. I didn't know how without losing you. Well, you figured out how to lose me anyway. She pulled her phone from her pocket, showing him the screen. The journalist's post had already been shared thousands of times, complete with photos of Ethan at the coffee shop and speculation about his secret romance with a barista. By tomorrow, everyone will know, my coworkers, my classmates. Sophie's voice wavered. Was it worth it? Your little experiment in being normal. Ethan's face crumpled. You were never part of an experiment. What I feel for you is real. I don't even know who you are, Sophie whispered. Please don't contact me again. Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away, each step carrying her further from the future she'd foolishly begun to imagine. Behind her, Ethan remained rooted to the spot, watching the only genuine connection he'd ever known disappear around the corner. Ethan stood on the marble balcony of the Carter family estate, staring at the manicured gardens below without really seeing them. 3 days had passed since Sophie walked away, 3 days of unanswered texts and calls that went straight to voicemail. The emptiness he felt was unlike anything he'd experienced before. I told you it wouldn't work, Richard Carter's voice came from behind him. Ethan's father approached with deliberate steps, a glass of scotch in his hand. Playing at being ordinary. Ethan didn't turn around. I wasn't playing at anything. Richard raised an eyebrow. Then what would you call abandoning your responsibilities to pour coffee and chase after some girl who works for minimum wage? Her name is Sophie, Ethan said through gritted teeth. And I wasn't abandoning anything. I was trying to understand what our company actually means to real people. Richard laughed, the sound devoid of warmth. Real people, as opposed to what? Unreal people like us. You know what I mean. I know you've embarrassed this family. Richard placed his untouched drink on the balcony railing. The board meeting is tomorrow. The Singapore expansion won't wait for your identity crisis to resolve itself. Ethan exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. I'm not coming back, Dad. Richard set his glass down with a sharp clink. Oh, you think you're not coming back? But you will. You're still legally bound to the company, Ethan, unless you want a courtroom battle over every cent you've ever spent in your little experiment. Ethan's stomach tightened. You wouldn't do that. Try me. Richard's voice was cold. You're either my son, or you're just another problem I need to solve. Did you really think you could just live like a regular person? You were born to be at the top, Ethan. The sooner you accept that, the better. Sophie saw me, Ethan said, almost to himself. Not the Carter name or the money, just me. And now she's seen all of it and wants nothing to do with you, Richard pointed out brutally. That's reality, son. People either want you for your money or resent you for having it. There's no in between. The words landed like physical blows. Ethan turned back to the view, unable to bear the satisfied look in his father's eyes. The helicopter leaves for the board meeting at 9 a.m., Richard continued, already walking away. I expect you to be on it, properly dressed and prepared to take your rightful place. When his father's footsteps faded, Ethan pulled out his phone one last time. His thumb hovered over Sophie's contact information. What could he possibly say that would make a difference now? With a sudden clarity, Ethan realized he had to find his own path, one that wasn't defined by either his father's expectations or Sophie's rejection. Sophie's pencil moved across the page with swift, angry strokes. The library was quiet except for the occasional turning of pages and soft tapping of keyboards. 3 weeks had passed since the truth about Ethan exploded into her life, and she'd thrown herself into schoolwork with renewed determination. That doesn't look like Renaissance art to me, whispered Jen, her classmate, peering over at Sophie's sketchbook. Sophie glanced down at her drawing, dark, chaotic lines forming a cityscape that felt more like her emotional state than anything she'd studied. Just clearing my head. Have you seen this? Jen slid her phone across the table. On the screen was a business news article, Carter heir resigns from family business, shocking board and investors. Sophie's heart lurched against her will. The article showed a formal photo of Ethan in a suit, looking nothing like the man she'd known. Isn't that your coffee shop guy? Jen asked. The one who? Yes, Sophie cut her off, pushing the phone away. And I really don't want to talk about it. Later that evening, after her shift at Brood Awakening, Sophie helped her mother prepare dinner. The small apartment felt safe, a world away from high-rise offices and billion-dollar decisions. You're quiet tonight, Maria observed, stirring the pot of soup on the stove. Sophie shrugged. Busy day. Is it the boy? Ethan? Sophie nearly dropped the plate she was holding. Mom, please. Maria continued, undeterred. Your father wasn't always the man you remember. When we met, he was kind, idealistic. Money changed him, not the other way around. This isn't about Dad, Sophie insisted, though the parallel wasn't lost on her. Ethan lied to me for months. He watched me struggle to make ends meet while he was probably going home to a penthouse every night. Maybe, Maria said gently, or maybe he was struggling in ways you couldn't see. Sophie wanted to argue but found herself remembering fragments of conversations, Ethan's tense expression whenever his phone rang, his comments about expectations and freedom. Had there been truth buried within the lies? It doesn't matter anymore, Sophie said finally. He's gone back to his world, and I'm still here in mine. Exactly where I belong. But that night, as she worked on a term paper, Sophie found herself searching for more news about Ethan's resignation. The articles revealed little, just corporate statements about pursuing other opportunities and speculation about family tensions. Whatever Ethan was doing, it wasn't her concern anymore. Sophie had her own path to follow, her own future to build. She closed her laptop, determined to focus on the things she could control, her education, her job, taking care of her mother. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, Sophie couldn't help wondering where Ethan was tonight and if he ever thought of her. The campus coffee shop wasn't as good as Brood Awakening, but Sophie needed a change of scenery. Midterms loomed, and she couldn't risk running into reminders of Ethan at her workplace. 2 months had passed since their confrontation in the alley, and the gossip had finally begun to fade. Sophie? Sophie Gardner? She looked up from her textbook to see a tall, well-dressed man approaching her table. Something about his confident stride seemed familiar. I'm James, he said, extending his hand. James Whitaker. I'm a friend of Ethan's from business school. Sophie stiffened. I'm not interested in talking about Ethan. Just 5 minutes, James insisted, taking the seat across from her without waiting for permission. I saw you through the window, and I couldn't pass up the chance to set something straight. There's nothing to set straight, Sophie replied coldly. He lied. End of story. James studied her for a moment. Did you know Ethan was supposed to take over as CEO this year? His father had been grooming him since he was 18. Despite herself, Sophie felt a flicker of curiosity. So, Ethan hated it. All of it, the expectations, the privilege, the way people treated him like he was nothing but a bank account. James leaned forward. The day he met you on that bus, he just walked out of a board meeting after telling his father he needed time away. Sophie's grip tightened around her coffee cup. Why are you telling me this? Because Ethan's gone, James said simply. He quit the company, refused his trust fund, and left. No one knows where he is, not even his family. The news hit Sophie harder than she expected. That's extreme. Is it? James raised an eyebrow. Or is it exactly what he told you he wanted? Freedom to be himself, without the Carter name defining him. Sophie remembered Ethan's words at the coffee shop. What do you want? He'd asked. Freedom, he'd answered when she turned the question back on him. To just be me. Look, James continued, I'm not saying you should forgive him for lying. But maybe consider that Ethan's relationship with you was the most honest thing in his life, even with the omissions. After James left, Sophie sat motionless, her textbook forgotten. She'd been so focused on how Ethan had deceived her that she hadn't considered what their relationship might have meant to him. That evening, as she walked home, Sophie passed a newsstand with a business magazine. The headline caught her eye, Carter Hotels faces uncertain future without heir apparent. For the first time since their breakup, Sophie allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to Ethan's story than she'd been willing to see. The Pinewood Lodge sat nestled against the mountains, its weathered wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. Nothing like the gleaming Carter Grand Hotels with their crystal chandeliers and marble floors. This place had character, peeling paint, creaking floorboards, and a charm that couldn't be manufactured. How you missed a spot, called Marcus, the 60-year-old owner, pointing to a corner of the reception desk Ethan was polishing. Sorry, Ethan replied, adding more varnish to his cloth. After 3 weeks working at the independent lodge, he still wasn't used to taking orders instead of giving them. His small room in the staff quarters was roughly the size of his former bathroom. The pay barely covered essentials. Yet, despite everything, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. There's a leak in cabin 7, Marcus announced, dropping a toolbox beside Ethan. Think you can handle it? 2 months ago, Ethan would have called maintenance. Now, he nodded confidently, though he had only a vague idea how to fix a leaky pipe. Later, soaked but victorious after battling the plumbing, Ethan sat on the lodge's back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. His phone, a basic model, not the latest smartphone he once carried, buzzed with a text from James. Your father announced new CEO today. Stock dropped 3%. How's mountain life? Ethan smiled slightly. The stock drop would infuriate his father, but it wasn't his problem anymore. Nothing about Carter Hotels was his concern now. Better than expected, he typed back. Learning actual skills for once. A young family checked in while Ethan was on reception duty that evening. Their little girl stared wide-eyed at the moose head mounted on the wall. Is it real? She whispered. Ethan leaned over the counter. Between you and me, I think it might wink if you watch long enough. The girl giggled, and her parents smiled gratefully. Such a small interaction, yet it filled Ethan with satisfaction. These people didn't care about his last name or bank account. Here, he was just Ethan, the friendly guy at the front desk. That night, as moths danced around the porch light, Ethan pulled out Sophie's photograph from his wallet. He'd taken it one afternoon at the park, catching her mid-laugh as autumn leaves swirled around her. Sometimes, he considered calling her, telling her about his new life, asking for another chance. But what right did he have? Sophie deserved someone who had been honest from the start. Still, on nights like this, with the weight of the Carter legacy finally off his shoulders, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a different ending to their story, one where he had found the courage to tell her the truth before it was too late. Perhaps someday, he would be worthy of a second chance. For now, learning to be truly himself was enough. You should go find him, Lisa said, sliding a freshly made latte across the counter to Sophie. 3 months had passed since Sophie learned the truth about Ethan, 3 months of throwing herself into work and school, of trying to forget. But the ache remained, stubborn and persistent. And say what? Sophie replied, wiping down the espresso machine. Hey, remember me? The girl you lied to for months? Lisa rolled her eyes. James told you where Ethan is. Some mountain lodge, right? What's stopping you? Sophie had shared the encounter with James weeks ago but had conveniently left out the part where he'd slipped her a note with Ethan's whereabouts, the Pinewood Lodge, 6 hours north by bus. Pride, Sophie admitted finally. And fear. That evening, Sophie sat across from her mother at their tiny kitchen table. Maria's health had improved slightly in recent weeks, allowing her to cook dinner for the first time in months. "He lied to me," Sophie said abruptly, stabbing at her food with her fork. "For weeks, maybe months, and now he just walks away from it all. Like that changes anything." Maria looked at her daughter carefully. "And yet, you're still thinking about him." Sophie sighed, leaning back. "I hate that I am." She crossed her arms. "But I need to know if he really changed, or if he's just playing another role." Maria nodded knowingly. "Then go find out." Her mother's expression softened. "I wondered when you'd make that decision." "You knew? Sophie, you check business news websites daily. You've barely dated since he left, and sometimes." Maria reached across the table to take her daughter's hand. "The question isn't whether you should go, it's why you haven't gone already." Later that night, Sophie pulled out her laptop and looked up bus schedules. The cost of the ticket would eat into her savings, money she'd been putting aside for next semester's books. Was Ethan worth the risk? She remembered his face the last time she'd seen him, devastated, pleading, and she remembered her own anger. Justified, but perhaps incomplete. There were two sides to every story, and she'd only allowed herself to see one. Sophie thought about what James had told her, about Ethan walking away from everything he'd ever known, about his search for something real in a world built on appearances. Wasn't that what she wanted too? Authenticity in a world of masks? Before she could change her mind, Sophie booked the ticket for Friday, after her final exam and before her weekend shift. She'd have exactly 24 hours to find Ethan, say what she needed to say, and return. What would she say when she saw him? Sophie wasn't sure. Part of her wanted to scream at him again for his deception. Another part wanted to understand why he'd chosen this path, and a small, persistent voice wondered if they could start over, this time with no lies between them. As she closed her laptop, Sophie felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The Pinewood Lodge looked exactly like the picture on its website, rustic, charming, and worlds away from the luxury hotels that bore the Carter name. Sophie stood at the edge of the gravel parking lot, her small overnight bag clutched in one hand, doubt suddenly flooding her mind. What if Ethan didn't want to see her? What if he'd moved on? What if this entire trip was a mistake? Before she could reconsider, the lodge's front door swung open, and a family emerged, laughing as they headed toward their car. Sophie took a deep breath and walked forward. The reception area smelled of pine and coffee. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and hiking maps covered one wall. Behind the desk, an older man with a gray beard looked up as she entered. "Welcome to Pinewood," he said warmly. "Checking in?" "Actually," Sophie hesitated, "I'm looking for someone who works here." "Ethan Carter?" The man's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "And you are?" "Sophie Gardner. I'm a friend." Before the man could respond, a door behind the desk opened, and Ethan appeared, carrying a stack of fresh towels. He froze when he saw her, the towels nearly slipping from his grasp. "Sophie?" His voice was barely a whisper. She drank in the sight of him. His hair was longer, his face more tan than before. He wore a simple flannel shirt with the lodge's logo, nothing like the carefully casual, expensive clothes he'd worn when they met. "Hi," she managed, suddenly at a loss for all the words she'd rehearsed on the bus ride. The older man glanced between them. "Take your break, Ethan. I'll cover the desk." Neither spoke as Ethan led her outside to a small patio overlooking the mountains. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, turning everything golden. "You found me," Ethan said finally, leaning against the wooden railing. "James told me where you were," Sophie admitted. "I almost didn't come." "I'm glad you did." Ethan's eyes searched her face. "Why did you?" Sophie looked out at the mountains, gathering her thoughts. "I needed to know if any of it was real. Us, I mean." "All of it was real," Ethan replied without hesitation, "except the parts one didn't tell you." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Sophie turned to face him directly. "If money doesn't define you," she said, "then what does?" Ethan's expression softened, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. "Who I choose to be." The simple answer hung in the air between them. Sophie realized that Ethan had found what he'd been searching for all along, not an escape from his name, but the freedom to define himself on his own terms. "And who is that?" she asked softly. "The real Ethan." Instead of answering immediately, Ethan extended his hand. "Would you like to find out?" They sat on a fallen log overlooking a small creek, the afternoon sun filtering through pine branches. For the first time, there were no pretenses between them, no coffee shop counter, no hidden identities, just two people trying to find their way back to something real. "I shouldn't have lied to you," Ethan began, his voice quiet against the backdrop of rushing water. Not for a single day. Sophie nodded, letting his words settle. Why did you? That first day on the bus, when you helped me, no one had ever seen me as just a person before. Ethan picked up a pine cone, turning it over in his hands. I was terrified of losing that. Every day, I meant to tell you, and every day, I convinced myself to wait a little longer. Tell me everything now, Sophie said. No more half-truths. Ethan took a deep breath and began. He told her about growing up in the shadow of his father's empire, about the expectations that had been placed on him since childhood. He described the emptiness of a world where relationships were transactions and every kindness came with unspoken conditions. The day I met you, he continued, I just told my father I needed time away. I left my wallet behind on purpose. I wanted to see what would happen if I had nothing. And then I helped you, Sophie said, understanding dawning. You helped a complete stranger with no expectation of return. It was the most honest interaction I'd had in years. Sophie listened as Ethan explained his journey after their falling out, how he'd walked away from everything, refused his inheritance, and found his way to Pinewood Lodge with nothing but determination to build a life on his own terms. I make $9 an hour plus tips, he said, rubbing his tired eyes. Last week, I had to choose between fixing my boots or buying groceries. I live in a room the size of a closet, and I still haven't figured out how to sleep without hearing every creak in the old wooden walls. But I've never been happier. Are you really never going back? Sophie asked. Any of it? Ethan met her gaze directly. I don't know what my future holds, but I know I'll never go back to living a lie. Whether it's with my family. Or with you. The sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink. Sophie realized her bus back to the city would leave in a few hours. Time was running out for whatever this reunion was meant to be. I came here because I needed closure, she admitted, but now I'm not sure what I want. What are you afraid of? Ethan asked gently. Sophie considered the question. That you've changed, but not enough. That we still come from different worlds. That this isn't enough time to rebuild trust. You're right, Ethan nodded. It isn't enough time. The honesty between them was both painful and freeing, a foundation that hadn't existed before, fragile but real. Dusk settled over the mountains as Sophie and Ethan walked back toward the lodge. Their conversation had cleared the air but left them in an uncertain place, neither together nor fully apart. Sophie's bus would leave in less than an hour. I can drive you to the station, Ethan offered as they approached the main building, warm light spilling from its windows. Thanks, Sophie replied, trying to ignore the heaviness in her chest. What had she expected from this journey? A fairy tale ending? A dramatic reconciliation? Life wasn't that simple. In the lodge's small kitchen, Ethan prepared 2 cups of coffee, a habit from their past that now felt both familiar and strange. Old habits, he said with a small smile, sliding a cup toward her. Sophie accepted it, their fingers briefly touching. This is good coffee. Not as good as yours. The simple compliment hung between them, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. What happens now? Sophie finally asked, the question that had been lingering since she arrived. Ethan leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. That depends on what you want, Sophie. What I want? She hadn't expected him to turn the question back on her. I've made my choice, Ethan said quietly. I chose honesty, even if it meant losing everything I thought I needed. But I can't make your choice for you. Sophie stared into her coffee, searching for answers in its depths. I don't know if I can trust you again. That's fair. But I also don't know if I want to walk away without giving us a real chance. Outside, the lodge's old pickup truck sat waiting to take her to the bus station. Time was running out. We could start small, Ethan suggested. Phone calls, visits when you can manage them. Long distance is hard enough without adding trust issues, Sophie countered. Ethan nodded, accepting her point without argument. This new version of him, patient, humble, willing to accept difficult truths, was both strange and compelling. I should go, Sophie said finally, glancing at the clock. My mom's expecting me back tomorrow. They walked to the truck in silence, 1,000 unspoken words between them. As Ethan opened the passenger door for her, Sophie made a decision. Coffee, she said suddenly. What? Let's start with coffee. Sophie met his gaze directly. Next Saturday, my day off. You come to the city. We get coffee somewhere neutral. No promises beyond that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't a relationship, not anymore. But it was a possibility, a door left deliberately ajar. Ethan's smile was cautious, hopeful. I'd like that. As they drove toward the bus station, the mountain road winding through the darkening forest, Sophie realized that sometimes the bravest choice wasn't walking away or jumping in. It was simply remaining open to what might come next. Sophie adjusted her blazer as she walked through the museum's marble hallway. After 2 years as a curatorial assistant, today marked her first exhibition opening. Renaissance women, forgotten artists of Florence, occupied the museum's East Wing, the culmination of her graduate thesis work. Nervous? Asked her colleague, Thomas, straightening a placard beside a 16th-century portrait. Terrified, Sophie admitted, checking her watch. Visitors would arrive in 30 minutes. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, "So proud of you. See you at 7. The next message was from Ethan, running late. Traffic. Save me some of those fancy hors d'oeuvres. Sophie smiled, tucking the phone away. Their path back to each other hadn't been straightforward. That first coffee date led to another, then weekend visits to the lodge. For months, they existed in a careful middle ground, not quite together, not quite apart. When Ethan eventually returned to the city, it wasn't to rejoin Carter Hotels. Instead, he launched a small consulting firm, helping independent hotels compete against luxury chains. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sophie straightened a frame, remembering how Ethan had helped her hang preliminary sketches in her tiny apartment while she prepared her exhibition proposal. He'd been there through rejection letters and eventual acceptance, just as she'd supported him through reconciling with parts of his family, while maintaining his independence. The museum doors opened early, and a familiar figure entered. "I thought you were stuck in traffic," Sophie said as Ethan approached. "I might have exaggerated, to surprise you." He handed her a small wrapped package. "For your big day." Inside was an antique silver bookmark, engraved with a Renaissance design. "It reminded me of you," Ethan explained. "Beautiful, but practical." "Smooth talker," Sophie teased, though she was clearly touched. As guests began arriving, Sophie took a moment to observe Ethan chatting with her colleagues. He moved through the world differently now, confident in who he was rather than what his name represented. Their relationship wasn't perfect. They still argued about money sometimes, Sophie's ingrained frugality clashing with Ethan's occasional splurges. Trust had taken time to rebuild, with setbacks along the way. But standing in this moment, watching her personal and professional worlds merge seamlessly, Sophie felt a profound sense of rightness. Their story hadn't followed any conventional path. There had been no dramatic rescues, no grand sacrifices, just two people choosing each other day after day, despite their differences. As the exhibition officially opened and Sophie stepped forward to give her welcoming speech, she caught Ethan's encouraging smile from the crowd. Sometimes, the most extraordinary journey began with the simplest gesture, like offering spare change to a stranger on a bus. If you're enjoying this love story between Sophie and Ethan, don't forget to like, comment, and share this video with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Your reactions mean so much to us. What country are you watching from? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how small gestures can change destinies. You never know when offering spare change to a stranger might be the beginning of something extraordinary.